Okay, record on this computer. Okay, just for those who are logging in, we had a computer crash, my computer, and I've therefore had to go back and start again at the point where I finished roughly last time round. So that's what I'm about to do. I'm no longer running two screens, just one now. So share the screen and then put this in presentation mode. So if you guys can tell me, I mentioned this part about CP Snow. Did you hear any more than that, or just that much? Tony?
Only that
No.
part, I believe.
Okay, so I'll start from here again. So just to go back and refresh it. So CP Snow was I was going to change the size of this window too, so I get a bit more space here. CP Snow was a playwright, a novelist, and a scientist. So he would find himself at gatherings of the Bloomsbury set, I'm guessing, and find them being disparaging about scientists, which of course he was one. And then he'd say, well, how many do you know the second law of thermodynamics? And they'd get a negative response back. But he said, what I'm really asking is equivalent to have you read Shakespeare? So it's something that shows the ignorance that the artistic community has about what science is about. And that is still, like, afflicts us very badly today. So my way of summarizing these laws, I'm just going to change this window so I see just two people rather than a large number. First of all, law of conservation. That says what we find in the universe, we cannot increase or decrease the amount. It used to be called the conservation of energy. Now it's called the conservation of energy and matter. You can convert energy into matter and vice versa, but the total sum of energy cannot, and matter together, cannot be increased or decreased. You simply change its form. That's conservation. The second law is that, which I call degeneration, that's my nickname, but I think it makes sense. Order in a closed system degrades over time. And that, in terms of energy, means things go from high frequency to low frequency. So we have ultraviolet and visible light hitting the Earth, and what gets reflected back as black body radiation is infrared. That's a classic example of the entropy rising. The third law is you can only avoid the second law if you can find a place in the universe which is at absolute zero, but there is no such place. I call it the law of degradation. That means waste is inevitable. And if you think about how neoclassicals talk about perfect this and perfect that, and the belief they can get rid of waste and so on, that naivety would never have happened if we'd had this as our foundation. That's why I blame Smith for leading us astray rather than later people, because they'd already been following the wrong path that Smith set them on. So I love the way the beat poet Allen Ginsberg put it, and that was that you can't win. That's the first law. Playing a game of cards, you can't win. The second is you can't even break even. And the third law is you can't leave the game. And that gives you an idea of just how trapped we are within these laws. And what it means in terms of economics is you can only produce output if you have inputs from nature, things that aren't created by humans. So the whole idea of the circular flow, which economists wank on about, talks about production occurring inside the economy without bringing in the role of nature, and that is fundamentally wrong. So without energy, you can't produce anything. And that's my very first beginning. Energy is a critical input. Without energy, nothing happens. Then if you produce anything, if you use that energy to do useful work, or you use that energy to transform something from a less useful form into a more useful form, you necessarily generate waste. And you can minimize the waste, but you can't avoid it. And what that means is, if you think in terms of what economists have often called a surplus, and I've used the term myself in the past before I learned this material and before I developed my own way of bringing the laws of thermodynamics into economics, there is no surplus. What we can have, is a greater level of energy out for our energy input to get something, but that's not a surplus. Okay, it's a gap between what we need to do ourselves to exploit something and what we get back from exploiting that thing. But it's not a surplus in the way that Marxists talk about it, or even neoclassicals talk about it. So we take what already exists in the universe and we convert it into forms that are useful to us, and we necessarily generate waste that way. Now, if you look at the physicocrats, they were consistent with this. They argued there was no surplus as well. They didn't put in the same terms because the word energy was only invented in 1809. which is about 30 years after the physiocratic school ceased to exist. Okay? So they were that far ahead of their times. Okay? But what we do is we find stuff that's for free in the universe. We find the sun itself. We find fossil fuels. We find natural resources, plants and animals. And if we can grab that stuff, we can exploit the energy it contains. But to do that, we have to put in some of our own energy, and that's energy invested. So you can get a gap between the two, but that is not a surplus in the way that it's become to believe by economists. And then we're having secured that additional energy over and above your own input to capture that energy. The distribution of that depends upon power. And this is something you'll find very explicitly in the physiocrats. They're quite happy to say that this is quite remarkable, actually. I find that quite amazing on this front too, because even though they lived in feudal France and you had absolute monarchy, they quite happily said that the monarchy exists because the monarch's predecessors fought off other people and captured the land. They killed their way to success. Okay, they're quite brutal about it. Now, what you get out of Smith is the implication that the workers are producing more than their wages. That's the only explanation for profit that Smith can come up with. And he didn't actually know how. If you read Smith, I must ask at the end how many of you actually read Smith. I haven't read Moral Philosophy, but I have read The Wealth of Nations in quite a bit of detail. Alwyn, yes.
I was just saying that I've read parts of Smith, but not the moral bit.
Same as me. I've got to read Moral Philosophy at some point. Anyway, Smith didn't understand where this surplus came from, but he thought there was one. The neoclassicals came along to counter this with the idea of the marginal productivity theory of value, because Marx had turned the classical theory against capitalism by the time the marginalists became dominant. So what you had was 250 years of confusion over how wealth is generated. And what you had, therefore, as a result of that, ideology rather than logic was the foundation of both schools of thought. So what I want us to do is to start with a perspective that's compatible with the foundations of physics, and look at how physicists look at this issue. This is from a colleague of mine. I'll put the ideas visually, but it's from Tim Garrett, whom I'm working with on bringing energy into production. What you have, first of all, is solar energy alone, which is what the animals exploit. No animal, so far as we're aware, is exploiting fossil fuels. So the natural environment we see around us is powered by the solar system. We take advantage of concentrated solar power. We didn't realize it when we started doing it, but fossil fuels are ancient solar energy. Okay? And that concentrated form enables us, by exploiting it, enables us to lift ourselves above the level of energy that's enjoyed by the other animals on the planet. So here you have these high energy fossil fuel reserves. You have us when we've lifted ourselves up by exploiting those fossil fuels, and you have the environment where we dump the waste we generate. So you start off energy here. You turn the energy into what some physicists will call exergy, which is useful energy. So energy is the sun itself. Exergy is the sun growing plants on our fields, or turning a solar cell, that sort of thing. And then we dump the waste into the environment. Now, because the environment is constrained by the biosphere, that waste pushes back against our capacity to exploit the exergy. And as we use the resources, we deplete them as well. So we're the meat in the sandwich in that sense. And we're at a very, very critical time, I think, in the history of the planet, and being that sandwich. So the laws of thermodynamics were developed long after the physiocrats ceased to exist. But it's the only school of thought that's been consistent with those laws, which is horrific. And if you have to look back and say, well, why did they see what others couldn't see? I think a lot of the explanation comes from the fact that they were in France. And France at the time, we're talking the 1700s, was overwhelmingly agrarian and much, much more fertile than England for some obvious reasons. Better weather, better soil. And then if you're a farmer, if you plant a single seed, you're going to get hundreds back. And what you do in terms of tending it, being the husbandman, as the physiocrats called it, you're not making the plant productive, you're stopping other animals eating it. That's the large thing you're doing. So you're not, your labor isn't producing it, your labor is reserving it for your consumption rather than the consumption of other animals. So you don't create the gift, it's there for free. And then the productivity is not proportional to how much work you put in, it's whether you've got good land or not. So all this stuff comes out of having an agricultural economy to observe. And then because of that, the proprietor, the person who owns the land, and that's where ownership and power become part of how the physiocrats think, they get their share of the pure gift is well in excess of what they put in terms of labor. So the surplus is the energy in turnover, energy invested. And when you're talking about being a lord, not actually doing the farming, it's even bigger. Okay, you are enjoying the energy generated by other people by exploiting the free resources of the land. And you can then use those resources to buy other inputs and become quite dominant in society. But there's no surplus in Marx's sense of an excess of outputs over inputs. But they still made mistakes, and this is why I think they failed. So if you look at manufacturing, there's no obvious equivalent. And therefore, they described the manufacturing sector as sterile. So they saw agriculture as being productive. That's where the surplus, that's where the energy return over energy invested occurred. They called it the net products. So that's, you've got to put energy in, you get a lot more back. That's the net product, but it's all ultimately coming from the free gift of nature. So they call that the productive sector. But they called the manufacturing sector the sterile sector. And the idea was manufacturing took what was being produced by the agricultural sector and then turned it into a more useful form. But they didn't create that surplus. So there's no pure gift of nature in manufacturing. That's what they called it, sterile. And this is how Francois Quesnay put it together in what's called the tableau économique. He had three columns: the productive, which is agriculture; proprietors, which is the lords, obviously, and in the case of France; and artisans, people who take the output of the agricultural sector and transform that into more useful forms, but not making it in a product. This is the tableau économique, and you can read it down. It's effectively a macroeconomic model, and it gives you a chance to get more outputs if you change your productivity of one sector. You get a multiplier effect turning up. That's John Blatt called this the most sophisticated document in the history of economics, and regards Quesnay as the world's greatest economist. So to me, it's remarkably important. But they still said manufacturing was sterile. Well, that's a mistake. That's the sterile bit there, because they didn't realize what was powering manufacturing was coal. And therefore, energy, the gift of nature, is still there. You're still exploiting the gift of nature. Now, Smith couldn't see this role either. So he said, rather than saying, well, it's the energy input that makes us more productive, he said, it's the labor, work inside a manufacturing sector. And what that meant is that both the physiocrats and Smith were blind to the role of energy in manufacturing. And because in solar, it's obvious without the sun, there's no agricultural output. But you can't, if you don't know, as what we know now about the origins of fossil fuels, you can't see the energy input in manufacturing. And you don't know that coal has preserved sunshine. So that means that manufacturing actually is receiving the pure gift of nature. It's just the pure gift of nature from millions of years ago, okay, and much more concentrated than you get out of agriculture. So the increase in wealth over time really comes down to using more energy, not the labor going in. The labor is simply controlling the energy. It's not creating. Now, what Smith did by saying it was labor rather than energy is set off what became known as the value wars, the disputes between classical economists and neoclassicals over the source of profit. And that still goes on today in its own way. So if you look at the classical school, they got, as much as I'm criticizing them for that initial mistake, they got many, many things right as well. So they spoke in terms of social classes. The income source from which you gauge your income is vital, whereas neoclassicals ignore that. So you had capitalists getting money from profit, ownership of machines, and being able to command labor and exploiting the energy. Landlords got the land, they could get a part of the net product that way. Workers had to work to get their income. Bankers got it out of interest. And they rejected utilitarianism. So this is I think this is almost the opening sentence of Ricardo on value. Utility is not the measure of exchangeable value, although it's absolutely essential to it. And later he says, it is the cost of production which regulate the price of commodities and not as has often been said, the proportion between supply and demand. Now, later work, and I'll explain that as the lecture series goes on, shows that Ricardo's right on that front. But I've got to get to those later on. But when they tried to explain where profit came from, they couldn't do it because they had this focus on labor as the source of value. So here's Smith, and he says, in this early and rude state of society, meaning a period before the accumulation of capital, the ratio of the labor going into producing two goods seems to be the only circumstance that can set a difference, a rule for exchanging them. But once you have stock accumulated, so we're now talking modern capitalism, capitalists and production and so on, in order to make a profit, something must be given for the profits. Now, that's all he had. He didn't have anything better than something. They never worked it out. And the first person to work out an explanation, not the right one, obviously, but an explanation, was Marx. And he said, surplus profit comes from the difference between labor and labor power. So this is a book published in 1844, unfortunately edited by Engels after 1867, and we've lost the original. So Engels put some terms from post-1867 into this book, and I'll explain why that matters after I talk about Marx later in the course. But he said, the worker receives means of subsistence in exchange for his labor power, but the capitalist receives labor. The means of subsistence and labor power is what it takes to stay alive, and the cost of getting the food to keep you alive. Labor is what you can do when you're employed. And Marx would argue that the worker, it might take 6 hours to make the means of subsistence for a worker, but the labor contract required the worker to work for 12 hours. And out of that, that's the source of profit. And that became Marx's explanation. And that, of course, led to the neoclassicals saying, okay, you can't say work is the only source of value. Capitalists also produce value. And so what you got was this idea that value is subjective, not objective, and supply and demand analysis, setting prices, which got rid of the good stuff that the classical school had done. And the role of non-produced inputs, raw materials and energy, was completely ignored by almost all economists since. Now, when you look at the data, that is completely wrong, because the relationship between energy and GDP is ridiculously tight. This is data from 1971 to 2017. So it's, high capitalism. The horizontal axis is energy at the global level in terms of kilotons kilotons of oil equivalent. That's taken from the OECD. The vertical is world GDP from a database by the World Bank in American, I think US dollars from 2015. And the fit between the two is ridiculous. That correlation is 0.997, virtual straight line. Now, that alone is not enough because the correlation is high because they're both increasing. But when you look at the change, the correlation is still 0.83 from the change in energy to change in GDP. And notice I'm mapping them on the same scale. Normally, to do a correlation like this, I'd have them on opposite axes. I'd rescale the axes so they overlap. I don't need to do that with these two. They absolutely overlap. A 6% increase in energy, and you've got about a 7% increase in GDP. Down here, you've got this is probably a better example, 1% fall in energy and a fairly dramatic decline in GDP. The changes are ridiculously close to each other. So the takeovers out of this lecture is that, first of all, you can't derive economics from the laws of physics, but you cannot have an economic which is inconsistent with those laws, and that's what we have. And I'll show later that you cannot make neoclassical economics consistent with these laws without destroying a theory of income distribution. And the relationship between energy and GDP is largely linear. And that simply implies that you can think about GDP as energy transformed into useful work. That's what we need to think about to be 85% correct about the nature of the economy. So economics and ecology literally have to be joined at the hip. Okay. Now that's the background, and I think I'm not sure I'll do this in this lecture or the next lecture, but there's a bit of a nerd bit coming here, so don't freak out too much. Oh, I'll do it the next lecture. So I did think it was the case. So in the next lecture, I'm going to go into some of the mathematics involved. it's relatively simple, but it's still, people aren't used to mathematics. I'll have to talk you around that, and I'll try to do that. So that's it. I'll just stop the sharing of my screen. Now let's have a conversation.
Pretty quiet.
What's been happening? Yes.
No, I mean, it's pretty understandable that everything should come from somewhere. And it is unbelievable that basically currently in economy, they don't work on it. They don't see it. And this graph that basically energy consumption matches GDP levels is unbelievable. And like questions for me, like some Arabic countries in Russia sells their oils, basically their wells, to another countries. Why?
I'm sorry, my hearing is bad, and I'm going to have to, with your microphone and my bad hearing and your accent, I've missed a bit of the expression. So can somebody else just help me out a bit with the argument there? Because I did hear it badly. Tony or Cliff, any help? Or Roman, can you put your camera on so I can actually see you? Because with my bad
Sadly, I
hearing.
don't have. Sadly, I don't have my camera right now.
Okay. So could you
But
just try
what I
repeating
was saying,
every-
yeah, that's basically it is unbelievable that you can see how tightly correlated like energy that we consume and our GDP levels. But at the same time, like some countries just sell their oil, sell their gas when they can just use it to benefit themselves.
Yeah, this is something that when I think about the economy, I think at the global level. And then when I think about international trade or specialization or social power, I break it into units. And so if you look at like the UK, you can find GDP going up, energy usage going down. But that's because they've outsourced their manufacturing. And the same thing for America. With China, you find energy going up more than GDP, but that's because of the place the outsourced labor went to or industry went to. So at the global level, you get the accurate picture. Looking at the national level distorts things. And the national level, as I agree, it simply blew me away when I first plotted that. I went, holy shit, it's that tight? And the reason being that, I knew it was logically correct, but there's so many other, you've got to ship energy around the world and so many other complexities and inefficiencies of usage, et cetera, et cetera. To get it to be that tight was just stunning. And I often say when I present the work I'm going to be giving to you people over the next God knows how many lectures, I often end up saying that if I was trying to make my argument case, I wouldn't dare make up numbers like the ones I found that actually exist. I was going to be too obvious I'm cheating. The real data is incredibly close. Jose's asking over here, is crypto part of GDP? Yes, well, a lot of it doesn't get recorded, so there's parts that go off the scale. And we are talking the consumption of Bitcoin being roughly equivalent to the energy usage of Switzerland at the moment. So it is substantial, but it still hasn't caused much of a deviation in that relationship. Cliff.
Yes, I was going to ask, is it really, does it really matter that economists ignore energy? I mean, of course it does in one way, but isn't it more akin of just looking at the margins or the differences? For example, when we talk about work, we ignore all the work done by mostly women at home laboring. So, I mean, isn't that kind of akin if someone wants to look at the surpluses generated by labor? They're just ignoring part of the story, just looking at the edges. Is that necessarily wrong?
No, they're not. They're looking at the edges rather than the center. Okay, it is. When you look at the data, I'm actually doing some work on this right now with 3 economists doing the empirical work with me. It's what has come out of not looking at energy is overwhelmingly wrong ideas about production theory. but the way in which that does make your argument does make sense is that post-Keynesians have basically said output is sum factor times capital, without knowing what the sum factor is. When you look at it carefully, as I've finally worked out logically, that sum factor is the efficiency with which we turn energy into useful work. Now, if you add unproductive, if you add unpaid labor and things like that into the mix, you are talking about a ridiculously small amount of energy, direct labor. And even so, what people are doing is using machines to do it. Okay? So the energy consumption still turns up in the relationship. There's no escaping energy. Tony.
I'm trying to think how to word it. I am thoroughly amazed that people think a high energy civilization can change to low density energy and survive. And that's basically what the economists and politicians are telling us. And it's never, ever going to work.
Yeah. I mean, like the energy density of the solar is far less than coal and oil, and far, 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 far less than nuclear. And there's a strong case that we can't, have a high energy society with a low energy density input. The counter that I get from people who were specialized in solar and wind is that the amount of energy loss we have in transferring energy from a centralized location to where it's used in distributed factors is quite immense. And if you can have that low density being used at source, then there's a possibility that will be sufficient to enable certainly domestic consumption to be feasible. Now, the fall down point of that is, of course, you're not about to power all of the Giga Texas, Musk's biggest factory, on solar panels on the roof. Okay, and you're not going to be able to produce steel using solar power. The energy needs are far more concentrated, and the form of energy is different. So I'm sort of biased in both ways. I respect the nuclear argument, and I know that, of course, the great danger we face is if we're going to be forced to stop using fossil fuels, we're forced to have a collapse in GDP. No way around that. And the question is, can we actually have enough means of subsistence coming out of that for people to not die? And I think the answer to that is probably no, given the transition we have to make. So it's quite worrying. But I'm sort of caught between the two on the nuclear versus fossil fuel front, and I'm not going to. I don't know enough to come down on one side or the other. I am biased towards the nuclear end of the argument.
I keep going back to what Tim Garrett says.
Yeah.
We know that if we stop using fossil fuels, we will collapse.
Yeah, absolutely. No doubt about that. And the trouble is,
however, if we don't stop using fossil fuels, we will collapse, but just a bit slower.
Yeah, he said that tweet out today. Did you see his tweet today?
Yeah, that's right.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful expression. We have a choice of collapsing quickly or collapsing slowly. And slowly might be pretty quickly, which is a real worry.
Oh, yeah. There's a difference between individual integer years and decades, I think.
Yeah. Jose. You're muted, Jose. Well, you're not being heard anyway. Try again. You're not muted. Try to say something. I'm not hearing you. Is anybody hearing Jose?
No.
Jose, we might get you. Jose, we might get you to try to fix your sound is not working.
Is it working
Try to get
now?
it work. Yes, we can. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
yeah. And I was just gonna say that I have a friend that is nuclear engineering, and I remember him telling me that what he thought was the only viable option to phase out fossil fuels is nuclear, actually. And he studied here in Sweden, where I live. So here is the green movement is very big, and everybody is into solar and wind. And he thought that was actually an excuse, and that the big fossil fuel company actually invested a lot in solar and wind, even because that's not a viable option to fossil fuels. I'm not sure how correct he is, but yeah.
I mean, it's a very difficult question. But one of my good friends and colleagues is a guy called Simon Michow. And Simon has done extremely detailed work challenging the possibility of having a solar-based power system, and even challenging the possibility of being able to expand our current production system to replace fossil fuels, which is Tim Garrett's point. And at the moment, solar and renewable in general, which includes hydroelectric power, accounts for between 15 and 20% of total energy production generation. And so we've got to have 5 times as many of everything as we currently have in the renewable band to replace fossil fuels if we got rid of them. And the amount of investment necessary to do that is just staggering. And therefore, the argument is that there's no chance really of maintaining our current standard of living while going through a transition if we are starting now. And we haven't even started now. Okay. In general, what we've done is we've added solar and wind onto our current use of mainly fossil fuels and expanded our production. We haven't replaced and maintained production at a constant level. So if we are forced to go off, and the energy needed as well, as Cliff just typed over in the corner there, because to actually make the solar and the wind, you've got to be using energy to make them in the first place. So there's an enormous dependency upon energy and fossil fuel energy. Even if we want to get off fossil fuel energy, we're going to need fossil fuel energy to get off fossil fuel energy. And that's why I'm so angry, and I really am angry about the economists who've delayed us on this front, because they are probably setting up human civilization for collapse.
Wouldn't a solution be in the realm of like do nuclear in the parts of the world where nuclear is we can do nuclear, like in Sweden and France and in other places where there are the minerals and the materials for, or enough sun should be used there instead. And I guess also degrowth in the north also,
degrowth and a dramatic drop in inequality of income distribution, I think, is absolutely essential. They're more important, given their scale, than the energy replacement at the moment. But of course, politically, they're not feasible at the moment. But I think when we start seeing what's happening this year replaced by what happens next year and the year after, at some point it has to get terrifying enough for people to say, holy shit, it's either change or go extinct. And I think, unfortunately, economists have wasted 50 years of our time, and that's 2 generations. It's a 4-fold increase in energy consumption. They've wasted our time through that with the shit they produce. Alwyn.
Yes, I very strongly agree with what's been said, and with Tony's perspective. It makes me feel quite negative. I share that negativity, but I'd throw in some extra issues about the barriers, and the political barriers in particular, because people like Amory Lovins a long while ago was dealing with this issue and was trying to get the Americans to be efficient. He was trying to sell efficiency. Not just in reducing energy and in moving us towards a lower energy economy, but it was good for business because it was cheaper to do the efficiency than to waste the energy. And the other point is the point that Richard Corrin here has made on school, which is that electrification, if we can electrify as much as possible that is currently run by heat engines, meaning transport basically, then we get roughly a factor of 2 benefit, simply because electrical engines are not subject to the Carnot limit that the heat engines are. So your factor of 5 maybe could go down to a factor of 2.5, and maybe if we can get some efficiency in there, it might be a factor of 2. But it's still a big factor, and it's a huge amount of money.
Yeah, I mean, it's feasible. The trouble is, the longer we talk about it and the less time we get towards going to it, the more critical and dangerous this is. And that's the problem. It is really an issue of time. And I really think it's the next decade. That's what scares me. Rodrigo, Roman, pardon me, Roman.
Oh, yeah. I mean, probably we are lacking knowledge in this area for sure. And probably for someone who want to understand like what nuclear can do. And probably you are right about going to electrify everything will be too expensive, even from materials. Like we don't have enough materials to make it. And even like you need to dig it from the ground and you need to deliver it to different country, and you have to have diesel for it. And probably anybody who wants to think about it and maybe learn a bit, the Great Simplification of Nate Hagen's podcast will be a good start. And I believe Steve was on this podcast a while ago. And the decouple, basically they talk about is it possible or not from like engineering perspective, like do we have these materials, do we have the energy to actually produce all these wind turbines and all of that, and probably it's just easier to go nuclear, and it is possible to go nuclear at this point. And like in all of this debate, especially me as a young man, I just don't understand like the capacity we have on energy. Are we running off energy? Do we have enough? Or is this climate which is the issue? Like probably I want to understand where to look for like the answers in this area. Like what cap do we have on this?
The best I can give you is the work of Simon Mitchell. I'll put Simon's name in the chat here. So Simon Mitchell is actually an Australian minerals engineer now working in Finland for the Geological Survey of Finland, and he's done the most comprehensive study I've seen about energy capacity and availability and the transition costs. And he's just said it's not possible. On the other hand, and I can't think of the guy's name, is the Dutch guy, a name like Otteria. I've got to look up his name. I'll put it in the link later. He argues that Simon's done his calculations wrongly by overestimating the amount of energy needed to make the solar and overestimating the amount of energy that underestimating the amount of energy that's saved by not shipping oil around the planet and so on. Yeah, and Simon, that was Nate Hagen. Nate Hagen and Simon and I had a very good time at Simon's house in Finland about 1.5, 2 years ago now. So we're all good friends. Yeah, but there's a Dutch economist, and I'll look up his details and put some links in the discussion, who challenges it. Now the trouble is, we should have the technology to answer this question in terms of bring the data together, know the energy usage we're making, put it all together. And we don't, because it has been something which economists haven't bothered with because they don't know the role of energy in production. So Simon did it all in Excel, pardon the French, fucking spreadsheets. There's no way to check his logic. He's got to go through and check each of the bloody cell forms, what the hell's going on in the system. And the other guy, I don't know what work he's done to do it as well. But if we actually took energy seriously, we would have had this technology not in computing forms, obviously. We would have been putting the data together 200 years ago. So we are ignorant, and this ignorance is going to cost us extremely dearly at the moment. Can you derive price and distribution of energy considerations? I'm not sure, Simon. I think that's one thing we need to try to do. And the likely implication are that you can. Okay, but again, the work to put it together hasn't been done. And like I literally know everybody who's working in the field, not quite everybody, but it's only a handful of people. You've got 100,000 budding neoclassical economists wanking on about Cobb-Douglas production functions. So the misallocation of intellectual resources is just ridiculous. Carlos.
Hey, hello, Steve. A couple of years ago, I read a book called Bright Green Lines. I don't know if you've seen this book.
I've heard of it. I've heard of
The
it.
reading is
Yeah.
quite disturbing because they present all the, the downside of, the solar, the wind, and the green energy storage and all that stuff. And I was just wondering, I wanted to know your opinion about changing the patterns of consumption or changing the patterns of the way we live. And I'm talking about, for example, abandoning the vehicle or prohibiting private jets, uh, prohibiting certain type of foods. And I was just wondering, what do you think about that? Do you think that changing our behavior, changing our patterns of consumption can do something about this problem?
I think it can. And in fact, I think it's probably going to be a major factor. So that's one reason why I've been working with a guy called Adam Hardy, who has a website. I'm actually putting details up on the chat right now, called ecocore.org. And at the same, I realized how dire a situation was when I started reading Nordhaus and his idiot friends, and realized how they'd so badly underestimated the danger we face and the blasé garbage that they put together and think is research. And I thought, holy shit, we probably have overshot quite dramatically what is sustainable. And we've got incredible inequality as well. So a huge part of the energy consumption comes from the very wealthy, consuming enormous amounts of energy. There's an article or a very good Netflix series about a woman who managed to con the American elite in New York into believing she was an heiress. Forgotten her name now. It's a very funny movie. Real story. And she pretended to have this huge source of wealth, I think back in Bulgaria or something of that nature. And a journalist started tracking down her story. And at one point in the story, they go to stay at this wealthy woman's house for a party and stay overnight in one of the many bedrooms. And the journalist, comes in to find her husband lying on the floor on tiles. He says, "Come down here and feel this." And the point he's making is the temperature of the tiles in Fahrenheit was 98.4 degrees Fahrenheit. In other words, they heated the tiles to the stage they're absolutely the same as body temperature, and you wouldn't know that you were touching anything. Okay? Now, that's de rigueur. I mean, you have to. I've been in a few ultra wealthy people's houses, and you simply have to see them to have any idea. We think wealthy means somebody who earns 10 times what you and I do. Try 1,000, try 10,000. And then look at the consumption that goes with that. So one of the wealthy people I met, who was trying to chat up my wife, I might add, owned not one, but two houses in a town called Chonburi in Thailand. Only they weren't houses, they were estates. One of them was for his helicopter, so he could fly from Bangkok there because he's a helicopter pilot as well. The other was a mountain he was leveling to make his desired, and that's in the one town. Now, these two houses would have occupied, I don't know, I'm guessing 200 acres, 300 acres each. Yeah. So we're talking about a land that would house 10,000, 20,000 people. And that level of overconsumption says, okay, you're out of it. All your houses are occupied by the poor people here. Power goes off at 5 o'clock at night. Forget your helicopter. No more cars. Bicycles everywhere, electric bicycles if you're lucky. That could halve, or putting that pressure on the rich could reduce our consumption maybe by a factor of 2. And then that makes our overshoot less than it is. You're shaking your head there, Cliff. What do you reckon?
I don't believe that. There's not enough rich people to affect by a factor of
they're
2.
richer than you think. I mean, the private jet thing, that's not a joke. If you said ban private jets, I don't know how much you reduce aviation fuel consumption, but it could be 20, 30%.
If the ultra wealthy reduce their energy usage, you can get a 50% reduction in the average energy usage in the rich world.
I think that's true.
Average American, I think 1%, uses 3 times as much energy as the average Indian.
Yeah, that's the international comparison. Most people are used to that. It's actually more than 3, I think, too. But it's the intra-country wealth, which is just so much different to what people think. And the entourage, it isn't just it isn't that Rupert Murdoch consumes that much energy. It's Rupert Murdoch and his entourage of 1,000 people who keep him happy that consumes a large amount of energy. So all those things mean that there's potential for rationing to work. So the idea that EcoCore came up with before me, and now, is to have a parallel price system. You have money prices for everything, but you also pay the carbon content of everything. And then the idea would be that over time, the rich would need to buy carbon credits off the poor, which is the redistribution side of things, and the pressure for reduced consumption would be enormous. But I think in addition to that, we have to go to rationing. At some point, we have to redirect production so it is absolutely directed just towards fundamentals, not towards luxuries by any sense, but towards fundamentals to keep people alive. And then in that period, we reduce the pressure humans put on the planet to try to hang on to civilization. And like if we did it well, maybe a 25 to 100-year period of privation, after which we'd be on the other side, and we could then have a wealthy lifestyle in general, with a lot of production no longer occurring on the planet. But I think we're more likely going to collapse into Mad Max. That's my bias. Alwyn.
This is directed to Cliff, really. I think there almost certainly are lots and lots of wealthy people in the world. 3 or 4 years ago, I read the Credit Suisse Wealth Report, which I found eye-opening, and I did some simple arithmetic on the total amount of money that the very rich had. I started from about 100 million upwards. And what I did was I halved their total wealth, according to Credit Suisse. And then I spread that money out across the rest of the wealth distribution, starting at the bottom. So I immediately cured world poverty, according to the UN definition. And I found I had money over. So I gave some money to the next higher decile. And damn me, I got up to the European working class before I ran out of money.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of money around. And the interesting thing is the Credit Suisse Wealth Report says that it only measures the declared wealth. They think there's 2 or 3 times as much in tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions. So there is a lot of money at the top.
Yeah.
Well, I would
love share those calculations, Alwyn. Yes, Cliff. Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. All that wealth is going to be made up of credit money on real estate. I mean, it's made up numbers. It's not real wealth that you can actually take and divide amongst people.
That's a fair point.
And for example, imagine distributing all the luxury yachts and private jets between the rest of us. What the fuck are we going to do with them? You can't put.
Well, yeah, but even more fundamentally is how much of the value of a house is actually real value, and how much of it is inflated by the way money's created, and the same for a yacht and anything else.
Property speculation, absolutely, yeah. Jose.
Yeah, just going back to the graph that you showed, that energy is basically GDP. Do you think that if we realized that was the case, we would have done anything about it? Because countries will still try to use as much energy as possible to increase GDP, I guess. And another thing that you mentioned with the heating floor and stuff like that. I mean, I know some people here in Sweden that pay like $10,000 a month for their electricity, and they get economic support from the government to pay their electricity. They have indoor swimming pools in Sweden, like all year round, which is completely ridiculous. And heated floors and everything. I pay like $50 a month for my energy at home, and I live alone. Imagine paying like $10,000 for like a family of 3 or 4 people.
I think that's people aren't aware of it. And I think I think a lot of the inequality we've got has been justified by a theory of economics that ignores the role of energy. And that's why I say it's such a fundamental sin. And I've only really developed this attitude in the last 4 or 5 years, since I've worked out the role of energy in production, and I've been working with people in that field. But it's such an original sin in how economists think, that if we'd been aware of its role to begin with, we would never have let the sort of society we live in now develop. But since we have done it, the ignorance about it is enormous. Like one of my favorite examples, and I use this in the next lecture, is a German neoclassical economist called Rudi Bachmann. He's a bit of a prick, so I give him what he gives me and then some. But he made an argument, and I'll use this in the next lecture, that according to the neoclassical theory of production, a 10% fall in energy availability would cause a 0.4% fall in GDP. Okay. And his way of saying this is that the alternative position, which is the post-Keynesian one that I come from, that a 10% fall in energy would cause a 10% fall in GDP, it is absurd because that violates the neoclassical theory of income distribution. But the data shows it's right, which means what's wrong? The neoclassical theory of income distribution. And what they've got us to do is ignore these inequalities and actually even to some extent praise them. But they are not feasible within the physical bounds of the planet. And we're going to pay that price. So the people who see themselves as the ultimate fans and defenders of capitalism, I think are going to destroy it. And that's the real fear I have. Okay, everybody, I think that's about it. I'm going to see a lot of you again tomorrow for a different lecture. I just want some of the young ones to turn up and see a bit more crowd here. So do me a favor if you can. If you have any people you know who are studying economics, get them to sign up here. It's cheaper than the other courses, you know, and I want to get as many people around as possible. It may be impossible. If that turns out to be the case, then I might, well, if that occurs later, move these things to Twitter and make them cheaper again. But that's a question mark. Alvin.
I suggested to Jordan that the student groups in various universities that are involved in protesting the syllabus and being rebels might be a good sort of marketing target. But the problem is they're all independent. It's really difficult. There doesn't seem to be a central body that Jordan could send info to and do some marketing.
There's one central body, the Rethinking Economics Group and the Young Scholars Initiative, but there's a bit of sort of anti-capitalist attitude, I must say, amongst them. And like I'm doing this as a capitalist enterprise, and there's a bit of, oh, I don't want to do that, don't want to pay. But you know, also their students, they're a lot poorer. So like I had to persuade Jordan to go from $497 per year, which is what the big course most of you are enrolled in costs, down to $49 a month. Now that's still more than $497 a year, you know, but it's a smaller amount. So it may be, to make this work, I've got to go down to $10 a month. Now, at that point, I don't think Jordan's going to be around anymore because there just won't be enough money for him, which is a pity. I've got to really like the guy. I must admit, he's a good bloke. And I would like this to succeed for both of us, but I'm not sure it will. So it may be a third iteration to get to a level where students turn up. The other problem these days, attention spans. That's one reason I've gone for 25-minute lectures here, to fit within what might be their attention span. But I would like to have like 10,000 students attending this lecture. I've got a long way to go. Okay, everybody. See you all next week and maybe even tomorrow. Bye.
Thanks, Steve. See ya.
Bye. Bye.